Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is our next to last session. Remember to stick around after this for the concluding session with Gabriela Di Giulio. But for now, to discuss future scenarios, I'd like to welcome our next group of speakers. First one, Lindsay Stringer from the University of York. Lindsay's research focuses on human-environment relationships, particularly the links between livelihoods and environmental change, and the practical and policy mechanisms that can advance sustainable development. Lindsay takes an interdisciplinary approach grounded in systems thinking, using theories and both qualitative and quantitative methods from the natural and social sciences. Her systems focus helps to develop solutions to specific problems while recognizing the complexity of the world's sustainable development challenges and the trade-offs and opportunities created by change. In 2017, Lindsay won a Wolfson Merit Award from the Royal Society, and in 2013, she was awarded the Philip Leverhulme Prize for her work on environmental change and sustainable development in drylands. She was an IPCC lead author on the special report on climate change on land, as well as on the most recent working group second report, Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. Our second speaker is Peter Sutoris from the University of York. Peter is the author of books Visions of Development and Educating for the Anthropocene, and as well as the documentary film, The Undiscovered Country. He is a graduate of Dartmouth College and completed his PhD at University of Cambridge in 2019. His research interests include the anthropology of development, the role of education in development, cross-cultural scalability of development interventions, development ethics, critical and decolonial perspectives on modernity and progress, post-development, development communications, and environmental sustainability. Next, we'll have Jon Gascoigne from the Center for Disaster Protection. Jon is lead risk finance advisor at the UK FCDO-funded Center for Disaster Protection. His work includes technical assistance for international disaster risk finance schemes and evidence and learning around climate risk. This work builds on many years in the reinsurance industry, analyzing catastrophe risks and designing risk transfer products for the private and public sectors. Activities included establishing academic research networks and coordinating with research councils. Jon has degrees in geography and spatial analytics. Finally, Helena Ribeiro from the University of São Paulo. Helena is Professor of Global Environmental Health and Sustainability in the Department of Environmental Health at the University of São Paulo. Helena completed her bachelor's degree in geography at the Catholic University of São Paulo, then went on to complete her MA in geography at the University of California, Berkeley, and her PhD in physical geography with the University of São Paulo. Helena, furthermore, carried out her postdoc with the International Academy of Environment in Geneva. So without further ado, Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. And a big thanks to the translators who are doing a fabulous job. I want to consider the extent to which an emergency framing provides an innovative and reasonable approach to deal with climate, environment and livelihood challenges and can ensure human and planetary well-being. And as mentioned in the introduction, I was involved in working group 2 of the most recent IPCC report, the one focused on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. And we have a statement towards the end of the summary for policymakers of that report, which is the politically negotiated part. And that says the science is clear. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. Now, reviewers and governments weren't keen on us using the words climate emergency. So that statement that was politically agreed is somewhat watered down. And we did have climate emergency in earlier versions before the negotiations. And this is because while the United Nations regularly talks about the Paris Agreement as recognising the climate emergency, the Paris Agreement text itself doesn't seem to use those words. I did quick search, and the only time I could find the word emergency in that Paris Agreement text, as far as I could tell, was under the section on cooperation and facilitation to enhance understanding, action and support, where examples of those things include early warning systems and emergency preparedness, alongside a number of other things. Now, to me, this sends quite a mixed message, really, because it seems to imply that the word emergency relates to the impacts of climate change. That is, the emergency is what happens after the climate hazard hits, when the people are left homeless or dead or without clean water or food and so on, rather than climate change itself being the emergency. And this seems to be a common thing in a lot of environmental change discourse more generally, in that we do seem to want to focus on trying to deal with the immediate aftermath of a problem after it's happened, even when we know it's going to happen, rather than trying to deal with the drivers of the problem and the problem itself. Another good example of this is the current International Decade of Ecosystem Restoration that was declared by the UN from 2020 to 2030. Restoration is necessary because we've messed up so many environmental processes and lost some of the benefits that ecosystems provide us with. However, to me, that doesn't really send the right message out. By focusing on restoration, it could be argued that it provides a license to continue degrading. It's all right, we can just restore it later. It's a problem for the future, not a problem for now. In terms of how the framing of climate and environment challenges as emergencies might shift perceptions or also current practices or policy responses, in some ways, and previous people have said this as well, in some ways we've become immune to the strengths of the word. I usually think of urgent as being action needed now, with an emergency requiring action being needed kind of now. When local or city councils in the UK declare a climate emergency, it can, but it doesn't always support the release of new resources to support actions to address the emergency. Generally, when a council uses those words climate emergency, they then have to set a future target date to reduce their local climate impacts, and generally that kind of future is 2030. They have to provide for a working group to quickly report on the immediate and longer term actions that are going to be taken, and they need to plan to engage with a cross-section of the community. Now, the cynic in me thinks, well, yeah, that's kind of what good future planning should look like anyway. So what actually is different just because we're calling it a climate emergency? To finish, I want to pick up on the planetary emergency language. We often seem to focus on our small areas, our small environments locally, without thinking about the interlinkages and relationships between environmental and biophysical processes that operate at that planetary scale. And when it comes to climate, for example, for a number of people, it's only when it becomes personal that it matters. When you or your family are disrupted or affected by a climate hazard in, I don't know, your house floods, or your daily activities are disrupted by an extreme weather event, or food prices go up because of a drought, that you really start to think about it as an emergency and you really start to feel it. And even then you might still not change what you're doing. For those people that are more dependent on climate sensitive livelihoods to survive, those people are living climate change every day. And most of these people are in developing countries where adaptive capacities are lower. So it's harder to change what they're doing, even if they want to, because their options are more limited. And of course, there's the element of injustice there as well, which sees those people emitting the least being the most exposed and most sensitive to climate impacts. So returning to the emergency framing then, a planetary emergency should require everyone to act now to secure our future. And as those IPCC words said, the science is clear. We are entering a closing window of opportunity where the time is running out if we do want the planet to be livable. But at the moment, we're not seeing that urgency from our decision makers, but also as the lay public, we're not empathizing enough with those who are more regularly directly affected in the here and now. So there's a kind of human element and an empathy that I think we're currently lacking. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Next, Peter, take it away.
Thanks. Thanks. I'll be a little bit more critical, perhaps, than most of the previous speakers have been. this framing of the emergency. And it's partly just to try and stimulate some conversation. So I look forward to any questions that might come up in the Q&A. But I think from my perspective, as someone who thinks a lot about how we as a society conceptualize the future and what we understand the future to be as an object, as an imagination, as a space, this framing of the emergency tends to very much constrain the way that we think about the future. It tends to create a very narrow vision of the future and a narrow pathway towards that vision. So I think at the moment, we are essentially looking at two sort of competing visions of the future, one of which has to do with destruction. We are imagining a planet that's not livable. We are imagining potentially an extinction scale event, that might impact humanity. And on the other hand, we are imagining what the alternative might be to that kind of a scenario. And I think that's where sort of technological utopianism, this idea of technology-driven solutions comes in, which also has its own problems, not least because many of the technologies that we are relying on in our visions of an alternative future are not yet ready. Many come with lots of other sort of ethical challenges and ethical problems. And indeed, some of them actually impact other sort of aspects of life on planet Earth in negative ways. And so I think, we have to be careful about framing something as an emergency and thinking about what are the implications of that to the actual solutions and the pathways forward. So I think, what I would say is that, one of the main implications that I see as a problem with this framing is that we have put the climate into the spotlight at the expense of many of the other environmental crises. And as a matter of fact, some of the ways in which we are trying to deal with the climate emergency is impacting negatively on, for example, the biodiversity crisis and some of the other aspects of what I call in my work the environmental multi-crisis. So I think that is something to be aware of when it comes to what the actual material outcome is of this framing. But I think there's also another set of questions, which is not just about the kind of future that we ultimately achieve, but also going back to the title of this panel, the sort of lens of social justice. Because to my mind, what we are seeing in terms of the imagination of these sort of competing visions of the future is a certain kind of polarization of society between the so-called elites and the so-called masses, where it is the elites that get to decide what the blueprints for the future look like, such as some of the techno-utopian blueprints that are currently very much dominating the conversation about climate and therefore the wider conversation about the environment. Whereas the so-called masses, the vast majority of human population is expected to basically get in line and to support these blueprints with their actions. And to my mind, this has a social justice implication in the sense that the right to speak to the future, the right to imagine an alternative future, the right to bring an alternative future into being, I think is a justice issue. I think the exclusion of the imaginative potential and the diversity of imaginations of the diverse populations on Earth is very much a justice problem that we need to face. In my own research in education, I see this very much, clearly expressed in the way that we approach, the way that we teach young people about the planet, about the future. We've got sort of, mostly government-run, under-resourced school systems, which are training the workers of the future, the people who are meant to become the cogs in the machine, so to speak. And then we've got a small number of elite institutions which are training the so-called leaders of the future, who are meant to be the elites that come up with these blueprints that the rest of society is meant to follow. And so I think this is something we very much need to pay attention to and to think about, not just from the perspective of solving the crisis, but also from the perspective of justice. So to bring this to an end, I completely understand why we use the emergency framing. Of course, there is an urgency about these issues, and the emergency framing helps us convey that urgency. But I think we have to be careful about the implications of that framing, and to my mind, to maybe try and counterbalance some of those implications. We need to place a lot of emphasis on the strength of our democracy, on the sort of channels that individuals have to speak to the future and about the future in ways that are empowering and actually transformative, not just tokenistic. And so I think if we are going to use this framing, we have to also think of corresponding ways of mitigating some of these potentially negative implications that I talked about.
Thanks, Peter. Next, Jon.
Thank you very much. It's great to have this opportunity to present today. I'm aware that it's very much a practitioner's perspective from me, a non-academic worldview, so practical aspects around considering natural hazards and societal responses to them. I work at the Centre for Disaster Protection, based in London, formerly funded by the Department for International Development, which tellingly has been dissolved since we were set up. But it focuses on the poorest and most vulnerable globally, and to what extent can pre-positioned, pre-agreed finance mechanisms be of use in response to a range of crises, predominantly natural hazards, so the climate dimension is at the forefront here, but also obviously health and pandemic, and also conflict, as all of these crises interrelate. And collectively, our work is known as disaster risk financing. So the work is explicitly around how emergencies unfold as disasters. We're aware that there are ways, there are activities that can be undertaken to stop them amplifying with respect to speedy response in particular, which we'll see with respect to providing shelter, food, for example, and stopping the exacerbation of impacts. And the role of emergency, again, I'll try and reflect on that. The other aspect, it's been fascinating to hear the comments made today and how those relate to my actual work. And I'm trying to respond perhaps in part to some of the lessons I've learned today from some of the other talks as well. So my team is very unusual in that it is fundamentally multidisciplinary and also covering both development, humanitarian, and increasingly the climate domain. We deal with actors from public to private sectors, often at a governmental level. So there is that, and also a particularly technocratic perspective. There's no getting away from that aspect. Much of the work involves some form of quantitative aspect of assessing risk and comparing risk and trading risk to some extent. But we work with multilateral development banks, UN systems, but also NGOs and community groups on the ground. But a key question faced with all of this disaster risk financing work is the locally led agenda, as it's known as, the localization agenda. One is, there's a lot of talk around lots of pilot studies being put in place, and there's a desire to go to scale for economic efficiencies. But there's also a contradiction there in that, does that mean some kind of boilerplate activity, some kind of template that is taken from one community to another, irrespective of the specificities of that location? But one thing that is certainly true is that to be more effective, and what do we mean by effective? And it has to be essentially around meeting development goals and including eventually things like UN Sustainable Development Goals, is that if you don't consider the local voices, if you can't get those voices included in both the design and the implementation of responses to disasters, then they will be much less effective and suboptimal. We aim to promote better disaster response, mainly that means speedier response, as I mentioned, which allows mitigating unnecessary suffering. We want more predictability. Pre-positioning gives you time to build in planning and preparedness, again, ideally with a local voice, and ideally having that time before the chaos of a disaster unfolding should allow better considerations of equity, with respect to who is being reached and how much, or what are their needs and how can they be best met. So that avoids allocation by discretion. And ideally, we could also increase amounts of funding. And this notion of emergency, yes, as mentioned by Lindsay, I mean, the main way it would come up, and it's strangely absent from discourse, is that it is around releasing for declaration of emergency, which would allow funding to flow from some. Some examples of this notion of ex ante tools arranged before events. We can imagine establishing reserve funds, contingent credit, in the mechanism. Risk, for example, include Africa risk capacity for drought, in the Caribbean for both cyclone and earthquake. A key point then is that societies have always faced extreme events, extreme hazards, and that will always be the case, infrequent but severe. So in that sense, it's difficult to define them as an emergency in the broader sense, or maybe it's difficult to know what the value is because they will always be with us. But with the climate change, we are aware that frequency and severity is changing, as detailed in part by IPCC reports. How can we deal with that? One point I'd like to move on in the time remaining is, Jon, in general, I'd say that, yep, there is an emergency in availability of funding. For example, humanitarian aid is increasingly limited, and we're aware that what it needs to challenge is increasingly growing. But the label of an emergency, I say, has been particularly effective around aspects of governance and disclosure in the finance sector. For example, even in ESG, environmental, social and governance factors, where there has been a sea change in approaches to trying to incorporate those kinds of worldviews. The question is it more than greenwash? And there has been a lot of criticism lately that there's an increasing amount of hyperbole and exaggeration in the impacts of climate change. But remarkably, there was a notable talk the other day by HSBC, a chap, Stuart Kirk. I might put a link in afterwards. He says that investors do not need to worry about climate risk, but that's only because his worldview was so narrow on financial issues and not impacts on people and place. There is also that aspect of climate fatigue, which is a very real issue where people simply get tired of responding to that, a kind of cortisol chemical release. But I think that's been mentioned in some of the other courses. One other aspect, perhaps just touching on the aspect of social justice, and with respect to COP27 coming up later this year, is the topic of the loss and damage agenda, notions of reparation beyond adaptation funding. And perhaps there's a chance for questions on this, but it'll be very interesting to see how that develops and how the notion of emergency and response for people on the front line is response to that. So I'll stop there, João. Thank you.
Thank you, Jon. Finally, Helena.
Boa tarde. Eu agradeço muito o convite para participar dessa importante.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation to participating in this conversation, and I'm going to talk about the coordinated policy responses to health, biodiversity, and climate emergencies. Of course, the proposals or coordinated responses, have to be coordinated so that they can be more effective. But since this universe is very broad, I will only give 2 examples of proposals. And I'm going to speak about an emergency that to me has been very little, has been not much attention, is about the wars and armed conflict that has never been more widespread in the world. According to the Global Health Now last week, 2 billion people currently live in armed conflict zones, and conflicts are the most destructive activities on the planet. They consume immense amounts of natural resources and extremely polluting. And just as illustration, in the eastern part of Ukraine, gas and oil pipeline explosions released clouds of carcinogenic material into the air, and attacks on sewage treatment plants caused fecal coliforms to be discharged directly into the rivers. And the forest fires were caused by bomb blasts, and the country's fertile soils are being contaminated by heavy metals and radioactive substances that have been leaking from missiles and military equipment. The country is also home to 35% of Europe's biodiversity, in its forests and parks are embedded in conflict zones, including the Black Sea Biosphere Reserve, which is totally being destroyed. Besides all these environmental impact, wars have caused death, injuries, collective unrest, and a lot of poverty. And they're also largely responsible for a huge number of refugees. In 2021, the world recorded the highest amount of refugees in any other time in history. And it seems to me that the global environmental health diplomacy, international relations, and science communities in general, they have been fighting for rights to health systems by refugees and protection for displaced women and children, which is really important. However, these actions have been very timid for a diplomacy that actually negotiates and fights for peace and for establishing peace agreements. So in my view, fighting for peace agreements in various regions on the planet would be, in my view, the first coordinated response to the interconnected health, climate, and biodiversity crisis. The second example that I would like to speak about is about a huge engine of this crisis, which is the deforestation and the destruction of natural ecosystems. Behind them, there is this exacerbated consumption of natural resources, low levels of recycling, and a food model which is very much focused on meat production. Activities connected to deforestation are mining, extraction of native wood, of wild species, and also forest fires. Of course, it is necessary to separate criminal activities from legalized activities. For all of them, today we speak a lot about the use of modern and sophisticated technologies that allow great advances in real-time monitoring, such as drones and satellites. However, they need to be linked or interconnected to a strong field work and the participation of the local population. In the case of the illegal criminal activities, it's up to the military and police forces to act. But in terms of non-criminal activities, agreements and the negotiations are essential. Then, in this case, internal and external diplomacy, they play an important role. It's difficult to suppose that just the state alone is able to solve these issues. And it's necessary to involve the productive system, NGOs, governments at different levels, universities, local communities, and the cultural community. And then 2 points here are relevant. First of all, is to negotiate the acceptance that deforestation is not necessary anymore to increase production. And the second point is that forest restoration is necessary, especially in Latin America and Africa. There are huge areas with low productivity which have been deforested, used, and have potential for replanting with trees and agricultural species for generating rural employment. And the Great Green Wall is an example in Africa. And in Brazil, we have a recent project which is called ReGreen, which is a result of an agreement between Luiz Queiroz School of Agronomy, USP, financial market companies, the Moreira Salles family, that foresees the forest restoration of 1 million hectares of degraded land in 12 years in the Atlantic forest in the south of Bahia and the Amazon forest in the south of Pará state. The project has an investment of $2 million and provides for the planting of native species based on the tripod climate, community, and biodiversity, with land acquisition and transformation into conservation unit. In urban areas, there's an interesting movement of Brazilian landscapers to implant gardens of tropical species and or pocket forests that have given a new dynamic to these native tree species nurseries. So these actions, they exemplify that these changes, they need not only this recognition of solutions based on nature that can reinforce and improve different levels of emergency simultaneously, but it also defends a different focus that is given in public policies, and especially in the negotiation between actors of different areas. In other words, it's no use for us to keep speaking amongst ourselves, speaking amongst peers. We need to open this dialogue to the whole society and always considering the vulnerability, socioeconomic vulnerability of those that are discriminated, and also the vulnerability of the environment, not only of the people. So these areas have to be privileged in these coordinated response. And that's it, I'm finished.
Tempo curto.
Obrigado, Helena. Thank you, Helena. Let's move on to our Q&A. We have one from Poliana at congratulations to panelists, especially Professor Helena. I would like to ask, can payment for environmental services be a collaborative instrument to reduce environmental impacts on the planet? So this was on the chat box at 4:21 p.m. Would anyone like to comment on this?
I've got one quick comment on the relationship between disaster risk financing and biodiversity aspects. And it's a tough one, but it's crucial in how one starts to link the financing component with the disaster risk reduction aspect that was sort of also came up in a previous talk. And there are attempts to, they don't fit easily together, but with respect to, again, the quantification of utility of biodiversity with respect to ecosystem services, to what extent can the value of catchments, for example, to hold water upstream, be included in reducing risk downstream and thus reducing costs of dealing with impact? So a key element going forward around aligning adaptation funds, for example, from climate finance with the world of risk finance in that regard. And there are some examples there. Over.
Thanks. Piran also has some questions, but before we move on to Piran, is there anyone else who would like to comment on this one, on payment for environmental services? Lindsay.
Yeah, I think we need to be a bit careful when we're using PES schemes and what we're actually paying for, because we do tend to prioritise the kind of the provisioning ecosystem services in the payment models at the moment, and it is the kind of cultural and heritage side of things that can be neglected. And a number of our speakers have mentioned the importance of the connections to the environment, the kind of mother nature side of things, the local and indigenous knowledge and what that means for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So I think payments for ecosystem services can provide one way forward, but we need to be mindful of the risks in terms of what's being excluded as well as what is being protected through those kinds of approaches.
Thank you. I'm Piran, please go ahead with your questions.
Yes, so just to tie a couple of the presentations together, Peter raised the issue of the danger or perhaps unintended consequences of focusing on single issue emergencies. And I think, most of us can see the benefits or the need to focus on many of these challenges together. But I would be interested to hear the panelists' reflection on whether that in some ways may make them less tractable, for action, or whether on the other hand, it could actually give more opportunities because it may bring in a wider body of concern and potentially more organizations, more sectors, more ranges of different people who may actually be interested and therefore may prompt action where a single focus may not.
Who would like to begin? John has raised his hand. Go ahead.
Again, I don't want to hog the microphone, but just to get in quickly, I mean, that's a key point about this issue of individual risks. One thing COVID showed us was the aspect of compounding of risk, many risks colliding and amplifying. And that's also an aspect of some aspects of climate change on natural hazards, for example. Events are becoming more complex. It certainly does make dealing with funding of responses less tractable. So much of disaster risk finance is around defining an event which has a start and a stop point. It has a certain, you are covering it for certain components. So that is an issue. And often bringing in more stakeholders makes it more complicated and slower and harder to coordinate. But nevertheless, again, it speaks to this aspect, I would say, of having to coordinate different funding pots for different needs, particularly Global Climate Fund, for example, adaptation funds, with other aspects of risk capital to try and protect the investments that have been made. Over.
Thank you, John. Anyone else would like to comment on Piran's question? Lindsay.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on an adaptation perspective, because I think in academia and the way that governance works, we do like to compartmentalize things, but actually, if you're an individual or a household on the ground with very limited resources dependent on the natural resource base, you're not thinking, you know, today I'm going to adapt to a health crisis, tomorrow I'm going to adapt to an education crisis, the day after I'll deal with the financial crisis. You know, it doesn't work like that. You have got that complexity of things that you're bombarded with that kind of shape your decisions as you go. So in that regard, it's a more realistic approach. But then, you know, by trying to appreciate that complexity, you have to put boundaries around things, and that's then when it becomes challenging. And it comes back to my response to the previous question. There's decisions to be made about what's in and what's out, and whose voices are heard in making those decisions. So yes, there is a need to bring in more actors, there is a need to bring in more stakeholders, but making sure that there's some kind of coherence that emerges, that is always the challenge.
Thank you, Lindsay. I got a note here from Patricia Carla. Hello, Patricia. Patricia asked a question that was actually in the previous panel, I believe. It was about environmental justice in relation to native indigenous people in Brazil. And I'm sorry, apologies, Patricia. I think your question kind of fell through the cracks. Perhaps Renzo or Daisy might like to comment on that, perhaps on the chat box. Apologies once again, Patricia. We were not avoiding your question, I'm sure. But I would like to give, because I'm conscious of time and we need to wrap this up, but I would like to give the word to Elena and Peter for their comments on this, if they have any comments on this discussion, before we move on to our final session. So perhaps in the order of presentations, Peter, would you like to add anything to the conversation?
Really, just to echo what I said earlier, you know, some of the sort of issues that I was identifying with this emergency framing. To my mind, the implication of the argument that I was making is that indeed, if we sort of use a slightly wider framing, we might actually be able to bring more people along. It does risk diluting the agenda, but at the same time, I do feel like this is a conversation that needs to be had among a diverse group of people. It needs to really be you know, something that a lot of stakeholders participate in. So I think keeping it sort of elitist and sort of retaining the power to shape the future among a relatively narrow group of people, small group of people, you know, to me seems dangerous. So that I would just echo that point.
Thanks, Peter. And if, by all means, if anyone would like to speak to Patricia's question about indigenous rights and environmental justice, even if you're not familiar with the Brazil case, by all means, please raise your hand and I'll give you the word for now. If not, Elena, please go ahead.
Okay, just to finalize, regarding environmental justice for the indigenous population, I think we can bring back the notions of vulnerability and justice, environmental justice, because we have to take in account the exposure to risks, environmental risks, which the indigenous population has been exposed in many years, but also the different effect that the risks pose to this population. And the third is the capacity to respond to these risks, which is very limited among the indigenous population. So the justice or the injustice facing the indigenous population is very large, even though they have access to land and to clean water in some parts, but the capacity to respond to environmental risks is smaller comparing to the rest of the population. And that should be taken into account in the actions and the responses made by government and by society as a whole.
Thanks, Elena, and Patricia, thanks for your patience. I know that I see that Renzo is also answering your question. So let me wrap up this session and very quickly move on to our final session of the day. Gabriela tells me that she's already prepared to kick off. So Gabriela, over to you. And thanks to all of our speakers for this third session.